Good morning, everyone. I'm David Way. I'm the climate director at BSR, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about climate change in a slightly more geeky way than Vice President Gore did. But we have to begin where he left us on Tuesday, which is that climate change presents material risks to your business. It ties together many of the risks that you face, and resilience to these risks ties together much of the sustainability work that you carry out. Because resilience to climate change is improved when women are empowered, when human rights are upheld, when inequality is reduced. But climate change is not like other risk. The Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures published its recommendations this past June, and the task force said that because, and this is indeed geeky, because climate-related risk is a non-diversifiable risk that affects nearly all sectors, many investors believe it requires special attention. And it is for this reason that the task force recommended that companies with revenues above $1 billion disclose how they address climate risk, and indeed that companies disclose how climate change works into governance and their risk management processes, even when the risks are not deemed material. And that is because, even if they are not material for you today, because they are non-diversifiable, they may be material for you tomorrow. And that begs the question of how business addresses these risks and builds a resilient, low-carbon economy. And for the climate team at BSR, this involves two equally important things. The former AXA CEO, Henri Decast, spoke once about a world with 4 degrees Celsius of warming as uninsurable. And that points to the first line of work that we carry out, which is that we need to avoid the unmanageable, avoid unmanageable risks by, in fact, pulling greenhouse gas emissions onto a trajectory that holds warming well below 2 degrees Celsius. This goal and this trajectory are enshrined in the Paris Agreement, which establishes, in words, a global trajectory of peaking emissions, rapid reductions thereafter, reaching net zero emissions in the second half of this century. And in the last 2 years, we've seen an explosion of corporate commitments that align to this trajectory, and you are familiar with them. Over 300 companies have committed to undertake science-based targets, which basically represent a company's fair share of achieving the well below 2-degree goal. Over 100 companies have now committed to procure 100% renewable energy at a specified date in the future. And that sort of touches upon the end point of that trajectory, which is indeed net zero. And that is the first side of the coin. The second side that is no less important is indeed to manage the unavoidable, risks and impacts which you already face and which will intensify in the future. This is why the Paris Agreement includes a second goal, to reduce vulnerability and to build resilience. The task force its work reminded us that in fact companies faced physical risks, whether they are extreme weather events and acute or short or long term, as well as risks related to the transition to a low carbon economy, for example, reputational, regulatory, and market risks. And companies which address these risks will enjoy competitive advantages over their peers, such as reduced input price volatility or a decreased or improved cost of capital. And so these are indeed the two halves of our work at BSR on climate. And yet today, this conference is about how business leads. How does business lead on climate in this rapidly evolving space? And this is a subject that my team and I have given a lot of thought to over the last several months. And we think it now boils down to 3 things. The first is to become resilient to climate risks. This means to assess your climate risks, to report them to the relevant stakeholders, to implement interventions and strategies to become resilient to those risks. It means following the latest IPCC science, which looks not only to the likelihood and the magnitude of risks, but also to how prepared you are, how vulnerable you are to them. And it recognizes that interventions to become resilient don't always take the form of hardened physical infrastructure. Sometimes it is about empowering women workers in the ready-made garment industry. Sometimes climate resilience is about microinsurance to adapt to local weather patterns. Sometimes it is about using social media platforms to enhance early warning systems. Second, business leads on climate by collaborating in high-emitting sectors. There is more carbon baked into some business models than others. And we haven't figured out yet the technological trajectories to get all the way down to well below 2 degrees Celsius in many sectors. But we can't actually ignore the lion's share of emissions in energy, in agriculture, and in transport. And these are areas which we should tackle together, where collaboration is valuable. And it's valuable because it reduces fragmentation, it removes concerns about competitive advantage, it enables us to scale up the practical solutions that we all know can be applied. And this is why BSR works on global freight through the Clean Cargo Working Group, through the Future of Fuels, and through the Green Freight Asia collaborative initiatives. It is why we are at the heart of building the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance in the United States. And it is why we are pioneering collaborative work on climate-smart agriculture in North America, because that is the way to tackle this part of the problem. Third, business leads on climate today by influencing your value chain. Climate action in direct operations is rapidly becoming mainstream. And this year we've seen the emergence of leaders taking value chain goals that are pretty unprecedented. Mars recently announced a goal of 27% reductions by 2025 across its value chain. General Mills has a, quote, farm to fork to landfill goal of 28% by 2025. And Carlsberg, a, quote, beer in hand goal of 30% by 2030. And the potential impact of this kind of action is enormous. Think about Walmart's Project Gigaton, which targets the removal of 1 billion tons of emissions out of the atmosphere. Just for frame of reference, the annual emissions of Germany as a country are 3/4 of that, 750 million tons. Or think about Hewlett-Packard Enterprise's supply chain program, which attempts to target 100 million tons of removals out of the atmosphere. That is just a tad higher than the annual emissions of Greece. This is a new lever for impact by the business community. And at BSR, we want to work with companies to succeed in implementing this influence, to work on upstream Scope 3 emissions, for example, through supplier engagement, to work on downstream Scope 3 emissions, for example, on product design, and to help others become comfortable and to join the group of leaders in using this particular lever for impact. So how does business lead? We think it comes down to today on climate in 3 ways: by becoming resilient to climate risks, by collaborating in high-emitting sectors, and by influencing your value chain. But this still leaves one question that we're very often asked these days by companies in our conversations with them. And that question is, what about the regulatory environment? And what about it, especially given the White House announcement of the US intention to withdraw from the Paris Agreement? I can give you the short answer. And the short answer, I'm going to give you a long answer too, but the short answer is that the direction of regulatory travel is clear. It was clear at the G20 summit in Hamburg, where the leaders' declaration reads, and I quote, "The leaders of the other G19 countries state that the Paris Agreement is irreversible." And it is clear from the response to the announcement by US states, by cities, and by businesses through efforts like We Are Still In and America's Pledge, which seeks to aggregate the impact of subnational action in the US. But there is a longer answer too. And we at BSR want to give you that longer answer. We want you to understand the laws and regulations being undertaken to build the Paris vision applied to your industry in the places where your operations are and where your supply chains run. And that is why, in about a week's time, we will launch the first version of the Climate Policy Tracker for Business. It will show, by industry and by geography, the state of national regulation in place to implement the Paris Agreement. Over time, we'll be adding more geographies, more countries, more policies. We have an aspiration to add in subnational regulation and city-level regulation so that you have the most precise picture, the best possible regulatory argument and state of affairs to take climate action. And when you see it in about a week's time, we very much welcome your feedback as we improve it. And I'm going to pause now to have a short video on it play for you.
The Paris Agreement on climate change was a historic turning point. Sector by sector, national climate plans are transforming the regulatory landscape that businesses operate in. Businesses that prepare for new policies and investment opportunities will be in a position to succeed. The Climate Policy Tracker gives businesses up-to-date information on climate regulation based on the industries they work in and the countries where they operate. By highlighting climate-related policy changes, it points businesses to know how they can practically respond to climate regulation by identifying relevant commitments from the We Mean Business Coalition's Take Action campaign. Climate change policy will change business. To get the certainty you need to make confident, long-term investments in this complex new environment, explore the Climate Policy Tracker. Take action and seize this century's most significant business opportunity. Visit www.climatepolicytracker.org.
And you can visit it now, but it'll be formally launched in a week, but certainly the site is up now. Where does that leave us? I think that it leaves us with something that UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said this past summer. He said, "The sustainability train has left the station. Get on board or get left behind. Those who fail to bet on the green economy will be living in a gray future." Now, you're sustainability professionals, and this is pretty normal language for you. But I want to point out when he said this in his first speech on climate change as Secretary General. And where he said this and where he made his first speech on climate change, he did not do it in the sort of stately halls of the UN headquarters that are shown. He did it at the NYU Stern School of Business. And what he announced in his first speech on climate change, he announced a UN climate summit in 2019, purposefully following the Global Climate Action Summit that California Governor Brown will convene in 2018. And these are marks that the role of business, that is your role, is ever more important. What really matters now more and more is results on the ground, actual emissions levered out of the atmosphere, actual resilience built in communities. And that means that it is your time, the practitioner's time, to shine. Before I go, I want to say that it is an honor and a pleasure for my team to work with you. It is through you that we achieve our impact in building a resilient, low-carbon world. And wherever you are at in the process of taking climate action, we are ready to help. Come talk to me, come talk to any of us. You know that BSR is a very friendly organization. Climate change is one of the defining challenges of our generation. We here at BSR have been with you for 25 years now. And it may take 25 more years, but we will be with you until it is solved. Thank you.